Welcome, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Digital Platforms for Heritage Places, where we'll be talking about how to amplify your Heritage Places online profile through digital access and storytelling. The webinar is part of a series of learning events that we offer on our Regeneration Works website, which I'll tell you more at the end of today's webinar. I'm just going to take a moment to walk you through the technical features of today's webinar. There's both a chat window and a Q&A feature that you can access through the top of your screen. There's a drop-down menu. Use the chat feature to share comments for the group and for the panelists. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, maybe we can get today's webinar started if everybody wants to share their name, where they're from, so the panelists get some ideas about who is here today. We're going to use the Q&A feature to log questions, but we won't be answering them immediately. There's the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. And please note that we will be sending you slides of today's webinar and a recording of the webinar itself. Next slide. I want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about the National Trust for Canada and introduce myself. My name is SONJA KRUITWAGEN, and I am the Manager of Marketing and Digital Strategies for the Trust. The National Trust is Canada's national charitable not-for-profit organization that leads and inspires action for places that matter. We have a long track record of working with communities to save or renew historic places, and a team that's passionate about helping you succeed. At the National Trust, we are on a mission to bring heritage to life in more ways than one. We get people excited about places that matter, places that connect us to our roots and improve our quality of life. We provide tools to save and renew historic places like Regeneration Works and a treasure trove of destinations to visit and discover. Over the past 2 months, we have been working hard to support our heritage colleagues across the country. We have connected them with COVID-19 related resources and subsidies. We have gathered the best expertise on fundraising and online heritage experiences, and we are hosting bi-weekly virtual gatherings with hundreds of colleagues to discuss collaborative ways to advocate for Canada's special places in a post-COVID-19 economy. As the COVID-19 pandemic unfolds, my colleagues and I at the National Trust are guided by our commitment to help Canadians protect, renew, and celebrate places that matter. You can learn more about our programs, access COVID-19 resources, and learn more about the benefits of becoming a member of the National Trust at our website, which is there, nationaltrustcanada.ca. I would like to take a moment to tell you about one of our programs. Next slide, please. Canada Historic Places Day. It's a national celebration of Canada's historic places, and it takes place on the weekend after the Canada Day weekend on Saturday, and it's been running for 4 years now, and it's held in support with Parks Canada. Now, we host lots of different contests and promotional programs, and last year we had 3.4 million Canadians that paid attention to this program. This year, because many of our historic places are closed to the public, we are extending the timeline for Historic Places Day to be the summer, so July and August, and we are launching new online tours, online tools that you can use for the program. So if you are involved with a heritage place, please check out the website and register your historic place at historicplacesday.ca. Now, time for our presentation. I'm going to pass the webinar on to our first presenter, Michelle DUONG. Michelle is an architecture student at Carleton University, and we're lucky to have her as an intern at the National Trust this summer. as part of the NSERC Create Heritage Engineering program. Michelle?
Thanks, Sonia. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. I'm Michelle, and as Sonia said, I'm currently completing a Master of Architecture degree at Carleton University. I've also studied architecture at the University of Waterloo, history and theory of architecture and architectural conservation at Carleton, and I've been working at the Carleton Immersive Media Studio for the last couple of years on their digitally assisted storytelling team, as well as on a heritage site documentation campaign in Paphos with Dr. Santana. I'll be talking about digital platforms for heritage sites today, and I will be followed by Richard Barlas, who will talk about the impact of virtual tours at the Hamilton Civic Museums. Then Christian OUIMET will talk about the basics and potential of photography and photogrammetry. Then we'll follow that with an open forum, and then Dr. Santana will give closing remarks. So just a quick overview, I will be giving an introductory talk on digital media, digital platforms, and the tools involved in creating this content. So a medium is basically a form of something that holds information. When we talk about digital media, we mean photos, videos, audio, or other content that is created, edited, stored, or accessed in digital form. This is a definition from dictionary.com. Now, they didn't have a definition for digital platform, but if we break down the terms, we're looking at something in electronic form, and a platform is a stage used by speakers or performers, someone that has something to say. Essentially, a digital platform is an electronic stage used to communicate digital media. I'll go through some examples of common media and some media that are becoming increasingly popular. Most are familiar with using photos, audio clips, and videos to communicate information, but panoramas, 360 images and videos, and 3D models are becoming more familiar. As I show examples, I'll also note a relative level of technical knowledge required to create each media. On your left is a photo of the dairy barn at the Central Experimental Farm. I've also added an audio clip, I'm hoping you can hear that, to highlight the intangible elements of being in this space, the sound. The smell is something that you'll have to experience when you're actually there. So you're hearing somebody walk down into the dairy bar through the hayloft. And this video on the right is a time warp recording through the historic walls in Avila. The image below is a very wide angle panorama of the same dairy barn in the middle of winter. So a panorama is any wide angle photo, wider than your typical 5:7 photo, or on today's devices, 4:3 or 69 aspect ratio. All of these could have been captured with a mobile device, but the dairy photo was actually an attempt at high dynamic range, that's HDR photography, and it was processed in Photoshop, which is a photo editing software. It was captured with a Nikon DSLR on a tripod. The audio was indeed captured on a cell phone, the video on a GoPro, and the panorama was also on a Nikon, and then processed in Photoshop. For reasons of photo processing, I will say that the photography requires a little bit more technical knowledge, but of course capturing audio and the GoPro time warp video is quite easy. The top photo here is a 360-degree spherical photo. What you're seeing is what happens when you flatten a photo so that you see the entire thing in one image. What you're seeing now is if you put the photo into a viewer, then you can scroll around and you can see that's kind of spherical there. On a mobile device with an app like Facebook, you can just swipe the screen, or you can physically move your phone to look around. On the bottom here is a 360 video, which works in a very similar way. So it has a fixed duration, but as the video is playing, you can also click and scroll around in the space. The photo was captured with the 360 camera that has a lens that sees in every direction, something like an Insta360, or this image here is a Ricoh Theta. They can also record 360 videos. The example below of ASINAPI was probably recorded with the UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle, also known as a drone. Using a drone requires a bit more technical knowledge than a 360 camera, and it also requires having a license. The Royal Alberta Museum now has a set of 3D models that you can view on their website. To create these models, a series of photos were taken in a specific sequence and then processed using software that will produce a 3D model. This is photogrammetry. Christian will cover photogrammetry in more detail, so I'll just leave it there. Creating a 3D model would require a bit more technical knowledge, and relative to the media that we've seen so far, it requires the most. So these media files come in many different file formats. I'm showing here some of the most common formats: JPEGs for images, MP4s for movies, and so on. When you bring digital media together to tell a narrative, they need to be hosted on a digital platform. We then call these files digital assets. These are some platforms you can use to communicate your narrative with digital media: social media, websites, augmented reality apps, virtual reality apps. An app just stands for application, which is a computer program used for a particular type of job. As I go through, I'll also note the resource intensity needed to use these platforms. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter are the top 3 social media platforms, each one known to host specific media. Using hashtags will help your audience find posts that are interesting to them. Museum Survival Kit is one social media campaign that has surfaced to highlight historical ways of life while in quarantine. Institutions are encouraged to create videos or post images using their branding, and then the content is shared collectively in their gallery. This all can be done with a mobile device and is relatively easy to do. Before social media, there was the website, and it's still the most popular place someone will go to find information about a site. If your historic place doesn't have a website, one option is to partner with Google Arts and Culture. It is a free platform that encourages open access to digital media. The partner, Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum in this example, provides and owns all the digital assets and gives permission to Google to publish the assets. They work with you to curate your narrative, and you can upload existing data or ask Google to come in with their Street View camera or high-resolution art camera. This process takes some organization and time, and the result will depend on you. Each asset you upload needs to have the corresponding metadata. That is, a set of information about the asset: where, when, who, how, and so on. A more immersive digital platform is the Augmented Reality App, or AR. AR is an experience where digital information is layered on top of real life. In this trailer example, you'll see an AR app being used on someone's dining room table, which allows the user to experience being in a landscape using a tablet or a mobile device in a cardboard viewer. This particular company, Time Looper, is offering the service called Time Looper Foundations, free of charge until at least July 31st. Again, you will provide all the digital assets and they compile it into an AR experience. They will work with you to find a way to tell your narrative. The process takes about 2 weeks depending on the assets you're working with, and after the pandemic, there is a monthly charge to host your app. The effort required would be similar to gathering data for a website like Google Arts and Culture. Virtual tours have been around for some years now, and Richard will be talking more about that. This example here is the Bytown Museum. It was created using Matterport, who actually specializes in realty services. A virtual tour is essentially a number of 360 photos or panoramas organized sequentially so that the user feels they are flowing through a space. Within a tour, there can be interactive hotspots added to show additional information about an object. Matterport is just one example of a company that offers the service. You could take the 360 photos yourself and subscribe to a specific plan and use their app, or as Bytown did, you can hire a professional to document your space for you. The Matterport app is compatible with specific 360 cameras or any iPhone above 7. This here is the Matterport Pro 2 and also the Nikon that was used to document the objects. Depending on if you decide to do it yourself or if you hire a professional, it requires some effort or a little bit more effort. This next example here is a virtual reality project that took many months to produce and a lot of collaboration between creative teams. Okay, this is a screen recording of the Parliament of Canada VR experience. Virtual reality, you can probably hear that audio. It's an immersive experience that removes the real world, unlike AR that layers on top. What you're seeing is the experience in a stereoscopic view. There is one image for each eye. So this is truer to how our eyes actually work. When the camera mimics the different angles of each eye, the brain can calculate the depth and it gives you a sense of being immersed in a 3D space. A monoscopic experience is like the Bytown example that I showed you. It provides the same image for both eyes and the experience is relatively flat. Now I'm only speaking about the 3D modeling aspect of the project, but the space was laser scanned thoroughly and some elements were documented using photogrammetry. Then there were months and months of modeling and optimization and the collaboration with many other creative teams. So to produce an experience like this takes a lot of resources. I will end with a quick look at the relative cost of the tools that I've mentioned. I've put the mobile device as least expensive, especially if you already have one. The DSLR camera and drones vary in cost depending on the specifications of the product. The laser scanner on the right, this one here is also a 360 camera. It's a bit more user-friendly than the laser scanner that was used for the Library of Parliament. And just in case you're curious, this is the current price of the specific products that I have mentioned today. I should also mention that there is a range of VR viewers and headsets, like the Google Cardboard, the Oculus Go, and the Oculus Quest. You should be aware of the different, the compatibility of the devices, depending on the media that you're creating. And again, those are the current prices. So you can see a big range from a $20 cardboard viewer to a full $550 Quest headset. And that's it for me, thank you. So now I'm going to introduce Richard. Richard BARLAS is the curator for the Hamilton Museum of Steam and Technology. Previous to this, he was the collections manager for the Hamilton Civic Museum System. During this time, he developed an interest in digital platforms and how they could be used to further museum work. This included both collections management software and expanding interpretation through virtual tours. Richard began his career with Parks Canada in 1993 and has worked for Heritage Mississauga, King Township, and the city of Hamilton. So, Richard, you can go ahead and share your screen.
I'll unmute myself. Hopefully everybody can hear me, and we will go ahead and share my screen. All right, so I have been asked to come on and talk about the cities of Hamilton's virtual tours because we've had them for quite a number of years. And I want to show you sort of what's possible, how they work, and then also talk a little bit about some of the analytics behind them, because I'm sure people are also curious about when you have a virtual tour, what does that do for you? How do people use it? What kind of interactions do people have with it? So we have a fair amount of data there. The virtual tours have been around for quite a while. I did the research and they actually went online on October 1st of 2011. So they are almost 9 years old at this point. Very originally, they weren't mobile friendly, so we had to do a fairly significant upgrade to fix that in 2015. Now roughly half our visitation is from mobile devices or phones, and about half is from desktop laptops or computers. There's also a small segment that use tablets, but that's less than 10%. So the tours are 360-degree immersive tours This is the front entrance hall of Dundurn Castle, one of the 8 museums owned by the City of Hamilton. There are hotspots within them. If you click on that, you will get more information about, in this particular case, the grandfather clock. You can navigate by clicking on icons within the tours to go to the next space. You can also navigate via map if you want to go somewhere specific more quickly. And that's actually, we have found a fairly useful feature, especially if you've got a longer virtual tour, to actually have a map so that you can wander around it. Tours were also designed with accessibility in mind. They came online around the time the Ontario Accessibilities Act the AODA came into force. So we also have things like basic, previous, and next buttons, so you can actually navigate them by keyboard if necessary. And each room has interpretation to go with it. And all of this interpretation also has recorded audio. So if I were to press that, that would be read to you as well. So we're going to go into the next room just to see how navigation works. You'll see that the tour begins by panning around. This is the drawing room of Dundurn Castle. You can, in fact, interrupt that if you want. You can pan and zoom on your own, any which direction that you want. Also, if you want to see a little bit more, you can fold this away, and then you enter into a larger panorama where you can see things a little bit more clearly. And you can also go into full screen if you so wish. So we have 8 virtual tours because we have 8 museums. They vary in length because our museums vary in size. They are made up of a series of 360-degree panoramas. They were actually taken with a DSLR. So there are a series of photographs, each of the panoramas, that were then stitched together. And that's, I think, the basis of the tours themselves. I'm going to go to another screen. I do encourage anybody who wants to know more about our tours, they're online, go check them out. You can either Google Hamilton Civic Museums and then just click on the virtual tour link, or if you want to go directly to them, because they are actually a separate website from the city's main website, you can do that by going directly to museumshamilton.com. So rather than spend a long time going through these tours, by all means, go check them out. I'll just show you one more thing before I do that, and that's just map navigation. If I click on the map, I can navigate that way. All right, I'm going to share a different screen, and we'll start talking about analytics. So we have analytics for these tours going back to 2011. What I've got in front of me here is the last 2 years. So basically mid-May of 2019 to 2020, that's the blue, if people can see that, and mid-May of 2018 to 2019, and that's the orange. So this is daily visitation taken over those 2-year periods. So you can see the tours are generally, people are on them. We can see some interesting things as we look at the analytics. One is the summer months are a little bit more busy than the rest of the year. That sort of backs up our view that people are checking out the museums, the virtual tours, as part of a general desire to visit the museums. So when the museums are busier, the tours are also busier. You can also see last year, you can see March break here. There's a bit of a spike there. That's typical of holidays and things like that. You can usually see them in the data. Again, people think they might want to go visit the museum, so they check it out on the virtual tour. What's really interesting here, however, is you'll notice that this year, my mouse has disappeared. There we go. You'll notice that this year, there was a huge drop right before March break. I imagine people had something else they were thinking about at that point. And then at the end of March break, stay-at-home and shutdown orders were brought into effect. And you can see last year, that's the orange, and look at this year. So there's been an obvious and a very obvious spike in interest in the virtual tours because of the shutdown. So that's the 3 months of the shutdown. You can see that spike there. So people still do want to interact with our museums, and they are, some of them anyway, are choosing our virtual tours as a method to do that. A few other significant analytics, and this is pretty consistent no matter what slice of the data you choose. About 90% of people are new visitors. That means that the analytics have never seen that particular IP address before. And about 10% come back and visit fairly routinely. In terms of where people come from, About 55% of them are referrals, and almost all of that is our main website for the city's museums. So that's the website that gives, directions to the museum, the address of the museum, how much the museum costs, how to book a room, that kind of stuff. Also has a link to the virtual tours. So what happens is people check out that website, see the link to the virtual tours, and then check the virtual tours out from there. So again, the virtual tours are part of the experience. They're not for everybody anyway, an experience unto themselves. If you look at, however, direct, there's about 25% of people who go directly to the virtual tours. So there are certainly people who are going and looking at them. And then social media drives about 13% of people to the tours. If you look at age demographics, this one's quite interesting. It disturbs me a bit that Google has this information, but they do. You can see that in terms of percentage of users, the largest percentage of users of the tours are actually the 25 to 34-year-olds, and it drops off a little bit after that, though it's still around 15% for 65 plus. What's also interesting about that is that if I were to flip this particular graph and look at how much of a tour somebody consumes, so how many different panoramas they view in one session, this would be unchanged. It's still the 25 to 34-year-olds that are driving the bus. So younger people consume the virtual tours more than the other end of the age spectrum. I also drew on the stats for mid-March through to mid-May, so just the shutdown for this year, just to show you what's happened. Been about 60,000 page views. That's individual panoramas. The average user looks at about 16 panoramas within the tours. That's enough for many of our museums have less than that in a single tour. Dundurn does not, but nonetheless, that's a fair amount. And most of them spend about 6 minutes on the tours if they're going to check them out. So that's a fairly significant amount of time to be on a computer looking at something. And again, we feel that most of this is people having a look at what they're going to come visit. One other thing I wanted to say that's important, it's not in these analytics, but it is something that we certainly know. Over the past 10 years, visitation of our museums has grown year on year. Now that's due to a lot of different factors. We've done more community engagement, more special events, lots of things you're supposed to do to drive museum visitation and to make a good experience for the public. But so the virtual tours can't take credit for all of that growth, but what I can tell you is they have not harmed visitation. That's often a fear people have. If I have a virtual tour, why would somebody go? In our experience, that's a non-issue. Visitation goes up along with having a virtual tour. So I'm just going to have a look at a couple of other things that I just wanted to mention to folks. Just to make sure that I have not missed anything. Interestingly enough, the visitor stats mid-May to mid-March, I wanted to pull those just to see them specifically, but they don't actually vary much. Before the shutdown, that was typical. Maybe the number of the average time people are spending on the tours has gone up by maybe 30 seconds, and the number of pages by 2 or 3, but basically it's the same. There's also a small but significant group of users, and it's around 5%, that actually spend 10 to 30 minutes on the tour visit. And we think these are either really interested people, or we think these are school groups doing research. And I have a little bit of empirical data for that. About a week ago, the tours went down briefly. And the reason we knew they were down is we got called by an elementary school teacher saying, please bring them back up. My class was using them. So we know that happens. A little bit about maintenance and upkeep. The tours do require limited maintenance because they're not interactive like social media, but they do require some upkeep. We do host them externally, so we do have to pay for that option. And one thing we have found is our museums change a lot more than we thought they did. So we also have to put aside a budget year on year to rephotograph the exhibits that have changed and the rooms that have been redecorated in order to keep the tours current so they don't actually get out of sync with what you could see physically. The tours are designed to make that relatively easy because each panorama is a page in the back end, so you can just change the content on a single page. But that is something to think about, is your tours will get out of date in time, and they will need to be kept fresh. I think that's what I've got to say. So I will stop sharing my screen, and we can go on to the next presenter.
Thanks, Richard. Our next presenter is Christian OUIMET. So as he gets set up here, Christian OUIMET is an architectural conservation technologist with Heritage Conservation Services at the Government of Canada. He has worked on various documentation projects, from large industrial sites to topographical battlefield terrain, such as the Canadian First World War memorials in Europe. He has been a lecturer at the Université de Québec à Montréal and taught at the Ard-Lemaire International Center for Conservation, the University of Pennsylvania, and Carleton University. Go ahead, Christian.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the National Trust for this invitation. The purpose of my presentation, it'll be a bit more technical, but the idea that I had after talking to the team on what the objectives of this presentation was to maybe have some of the sites hopefully be able to experiment with some of these tools. So my presentation is mainly focusing on photogrammetry, but I'll start to talk about photography, since that's really the foundation to obtain good photogrammetry, and some of the other examples that you saw in Richard's presentation, like the quality of the panoramas of those sites are really, they're good, they're properly exposed, etc. So that's very important. And as well as just record photography. I'll be talking about photogrammetry and about what is photogrammetry and what the purpose of it is. But record photography, like basic photographs of sites or objects, etc., is very valuable and probably the most accessible tool that most of us on this call have. Pretty much everybody has a camera. So that empowers you if there's a way to disseminate that information. If you take good photos, you'll have good information to share with your audience. So I'd like to start with like what equipment you would need. So Michelle presented some of this. Obviously you would need a camera, but you also have to take into consideration lighting. In Richard's presentation, the lighting and the panoramas was like the dark areas and the highlights that were properly exposed. So you can tell that the photographer took this into consideration and worked with the light that was available to him. There's I have the bottom left talks about the camera support. So the one that's most accessible to us is a tripod, but if you need to get into uniquer areas, I don't have a UAV or drone here, but you can use in extreme situations, people have used cranes, or you have these telescopic masks to get to difficult areas. And of course there's software. So if I put Photoshop here, I understand that's quite expensive, but there are some open source software tools out there that you can also use to edit your photographs. So today I'll mainly focus on the camera that most people have, at least a smartphone. And the available lighting that most of us have, especially outside, is sunlight, cloudy day, or indoors, incandescent or fluorescent light, whatever light source is available to you. Those are usually free, thankfully. And in some cases, you might want to consider a tripod. It's not an essential thing, but if you have really low light conditions and you're worried about camera shake when you're taking your photographs, the tripod could be useful for that. And if you do have a slightly more advanced camera, like a digital single lens reflex camera, so a DSLR or a point and shoot that has some manual features in it, you should take the time to experiment with the manual settings. If you're not comfortable with this, just use the automatic setting and let the camera decide for you what the proper lighting conditions are. But if sometimes you complain about, well, my photo's too dark or it's blurry, it's good to get to know these settings to get more comfortable with them and to help you understand what the source of the issue is, and you can hopefully correct it. And on your camera, whatever camera you have, especially if it's a point and shoot that has some settings that are available to you to change, different camera manufacturers do a slightly different layout of their settings, but again, get to know the settings and try to use all the available tools that are available to you on the camera. So I'm just going to back up a few slides here. As far as lighting and exposure, the main three elements of the exposure triangle that you see on the upper right are the camera sensitivity, ISO. So for myself, I remember when we used to buy film for our cameras, and you would buy 100 ISO or 400 for low light, etc. It's essentially the same in today's digital cameras. Then you have the shutter speed. So how fast does the shutter open to let light into your camera? And the aperture. So I'll really go in a high level over these different settings. But the aperture, the main thing to consider about that, it kind of acts like the iris of your eye. So in really, when there's a lot of light, the aperture tends to get smaller to let less light hit your camera sensor. If it's a very dark scene, well, you tend to open it up. And you'll see this with the pupil of your eye. When you turn on off lights on and off, let's say in the bathroom, and you look at your eye and you see it dilating, well, that's the camera's kind of doing the same thing. The smaller the hole of the aperture, the greater the depth of field, meaning whatever's in your focal plane is, the closest, the range of what will be in focus will be greater. So if you find sometimes you have blurry pictures, this may be a source of an issue. And the second item I'd like to go over as far as lighting and exposure is your camera shutter speed. So the quicker shutter speed, the more you capture the scene in a quicker way. And in these situations, you can just hand hold your camera and not have to worry about a tripod as much. But a longer shutter speed, you'll start capturing movement. Fortunately, most of our cultural resources don't move, so we don't have to worry about this too much. But if you do have a long shutter speed, that's when you do need to consider using a tripod. Talked about the camera. Your camera might allow you to zoom in or out to get a wider scene or a more telephoto sort of a situation with your photos. So for photogrammetry, if you can, when you take your series of pictures, and I'll go through this in a second, try to keep this fairly consistent or completely consistent if you can. But again, it's a rule of thumb. Some of the software now can handle these different situations. And if you see that your photos, the colors seem off, there are ways to correct this. The most advanced way would be to use a color card or a gray card that has a neutral reference point to be able to correct this. Usually you have to shoot your photographs in a more advanced method, not just with the JPEG format of an image, but a raw format, and you can correct this with certain software packages. So finally, what photogrammetry? So let's talk about photogrammetry here. So essentially what photogrammetry is the science of extracting metric, measurable information from photographs. There's a lot of examples of photogrammetry. When I was younger, I remember ViewMaster. So you have a left and right image that gives you that 3D feeling or perspective. That's essentially photogrammetry. Today, there's many applications. It's everywhere around us, like with automated vehicles, self-driving themselves. They're using photogrammetry as one of the tools to do this. In the Canadarm in space, you see in the image, there's like these black and white targets. Well, they're using video to take photogrammetry and take measurements in real time to see the relative position of different objects. And on Mars, when they say, well, how far a mountain range is from one of the rovers that they send, they're employing photogrammetry to obtain those measurements. And photogrammetry has been around for a long time, almost soon after the invention of photography in the 1830s. So in the 1860s, there was a German architect that started to think, well, maybe we can extract measurements from photos. The story goes that he had an accident from a ladder or scaffolding and hurt himself and told himself, well, there's got to be a better way to extract measurements from a building. And that's where architectural photogrammetry is said to have been invented. Here in the department I work with in the federal government, since the 1960s, we've been capturing photogrammetric images. So back in the 60s, or before the advent of digital cameras, we had to use specific metric cameras made specifically for photogrammetry. And these cameras were very heavy, expensive. They would shoot large formats, 4 by 5 inches or 5 by 7 inches. But since the 1960s, we have over 10,000 photogrammetric negatives, well over 600 federal heritage sites throughout the country, and also national historic sites that are part of what we call the extended family, that are not owned by the Canadian federal government, but are privately owned or owned by municipalities. And one example of their usefulness of these negatives is that you can obtain a lot of metric information in a little amount of time. And if there is a need to produce metric information, such as drawings or record drawings, well, then you can retrieve those photogrammetric images and then produce your records. So in this example, almost 20 years ago, in the old town of Lunenburg, which is a World Heritage Site in Nova Scotia, the St. John's Anglican Church unfortunately suffered a catastrophic loss due to fire. But fortunately, 2 years prior to the fire, photogrammetric images were obtained inside and outside, and then we can produce architectural drawings. So these drawings did not exist before the fire, and these drawings were used to document also the surviving fabric from the fire. Okay, so finally, how can you take photogrammetric images for your site, for your building, or for an object within your site? So there's basic guidelines to consider before taking photogrammetric images. So I talked about lighting and exposure. So if you need good photographs for this to get good results, if your photographs are blurry, out of focus, or too dark, too bright, it's not going to be an ideal situation. With this type of photogrammetry, it's called structure from motion, you need sufficient overlap from the images. So it's not just a question of taking stereo pairs. You're basically painting the object with the camera, and I'll show you an example of this in the next slides. The closer you are to the subject, the more detail you will get. So the further away, the less detailed. So the resolution of your images won't capture like individual mortar joints of your building, or even sand grains in your mortar if you're trying to get really close to your building facade. And your lighting should be somewhat consistent and uniform. The surface also plays a big role. So if for shiny surfaces, this is not a good technique. This technique really likes texture. So masonry surfaces, wood surfaces, but experiment with it. And sometimes Michelle showed the example of the dress in the, I think it was a museum in Alberta or Manitoba, where sometimes you would look at that subject and say, oh, this would not be the best application for that. But clearly the example she showed, it worked quite well. So if you decide to do this afternoon, this is what you would need. So obviously a camera, some lighting, and I'm gonna talk about a software package to take and produce the model. And I'm not necessarily endorsing the software, it's just that today this is the most user-friendly for you to use. There's an approximate cost of about $200 Canadian for the basic version, but you do have a 30-day free trial, fully functional trial, if you want to experiment with it. And so that's for step 2. And then for step 3, if you decide to publish your model, there's a tool, an online cloud service for 3D models called Sketchfab that you can use for free. I think it limits you to uploading 1 model per month or something like that. So earlier this week, I had to drop off my daughter for work on a Tuesday morning in the market here in Ottawa. And I was looking for a subject to experiment with, to be able to show you on how you can use this application. And I found this totem pole that I think was erected in the 1980s as part of a local school project or an art center. And the highlighted area in red is what I took photogrammetric images with, and I needed 80% overlap. So I went around the perimeter of the totem pole at the base and took a series of photographs. okay? Another way I could have taken the photographs is in this strip. So instead of this circular pattern, could have taken the strip, but obviously the pole is high, so I would have needed other equipment to do that. So I just concentrated with the base in a circular fashion. And then with that photogrammetric software that I mentioned, and I put the link in the previous slide, I followed these steps. So the text in white in each one is the workflow that you follow in the software. And if you're interested in trying this, just pick the default settings and see what you get. So the first thing you have to do is the image registration. So the software is detecting texture on the surface and figuring out where each picture is that I took. Whoops, let me go back here. So workflow, first I had to add the photos in the software. Then I had to follow the next step in the menu process and build the dense point cloud. The dense point cloud appears here. So what we're seeing here is millions of points, and the color is from the images that I took. And then the point cloud, I had to create a mesh because I'm going to apply the photographs onto this mesh. So the mesh is kind of like the canvas of the painting, if you will. So in order to receive the texture of the photos, we have to build a mesh. And finally, workflow build texture. So through the menu of the software, it's quite user-friendly to produce that. And then finally, I had a model that I could see in the software, and I exported it. And the command was file export mesh. And the format that I exported is an OBJ format. It's a sort of standard model format. And this is the ingredients that it produced. It produced the OBJ file. And then these are these really strange looking images that are the texture that are applied onto that mesh. Then I went to that Sketchfab website, created an account, and uploaded the model. It created a hyperlink, and this is what was produced. So let's see if this works. I uploaded the model. And we have a 3D model of the pole. I was playing around with the software this week, and you can actually put hyperlinks within the model. So here I put plaque description. For more information, please see. And this is the art museum that actually produced this totem pole back in the 80s. If I click on that, it'll bring me to it. And this hyperlink that you saw in the presentation, there's also instructions within the Sketchfab website on how to embed these models within your tour. So the tour that Richard was showing, for example, if you had a photogrammetric model of the fireplace, you can have a hotspot that links you to this cloud service, and it can actually open the window within the tour and not leave the tour and go to the Sketchfab website, but stay within your panoramic tour site and just have a pop-up window. So that's all I want to talk about. There's a couple of things I want to highlight. To do this, if you are interested in doing this, start with as little amount of photos as possible, because it is memory intensive for your computer, and you do need somewhat of a powerful computer. I don't mean like a gaming or a high-end computer, but if you have a mid-level computer, this should work. But if you have a really low-end computer with not a lot of memory, you might run into issues. Start with a small amount of photos. It's exponential, the amount of time it takes to produce these photogrammetric models. So start with a little, and if you think it's working well, you can add more and more photos. And I think that's everything. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Christian. I'll just share my screen again here. Okay, we're going to go ahead with the open forum. Sonia and Chris, if you wanted to start with that.
I'll just jump in. It's Chris Wiebe here from the National Trust. I'll just jump in. There was an early question that seems to have been very popular around Bernie Flaman and James Madigan both asked questions around hosting, around where these things are hosted. And I think it's an interesting question because what is the longevity of the hosting site of the material one of the considerations that people want to make right now? Are these internally hosted kind of images and materials, or are they hosted externally? I don't know, Richard and Christian, what would you say in terms of whether people who are just new to the area or should consider when they're thinking of that at this point?
Well, I mean, I can speak a little bit to ours, and they are hosted externally. When we first put this together, almost 9 years ago, there was some talk of hosting them internally or externally. They were a sufficiently new technology that our IT department was a little concerned about hosting them internally. They were mostly not so much concerned with the stability of the tours. They were concerned with if people accessed the virtual tours, were there any sort of backdoor they could get into other city servers, and they didn't want people to do that. So they have been hosted externally, and that has worked well. Now, the hosting organization in our case is also the company we contracted to do the tours, so they know what they need to do to host them and to keep them current. So that's worked well for us. I think you could go either way, but you would have to consider things like, you know, how much bandwidth the tours would need if they were popular, and that, and you know, is the hosting service going to be reliable and that kind of thing. But I can't actually speak to what would happen if we did bring them internally, because we've never tried that, but certainly an extra hosting option has worked well for us.
Yeah, I would say for ourselves, well, within where I work, it's not something that we do a lot of, because usually it's more for metric information that we capture this, and not so much for dissemination. But the work I've done with as far as teaching is with students is sometimes since we're able to experiment a bit more there, we'll use services like web servers, like Amazon Web Services, that sort of thing. But it does require a bit of know-how. And if you're serious about this, unless you have someone that's very familiar with this within your organization, seeking professional help, which I think is what Richard and the museum that he's with have done, will probably be more cost effective instead of trying to figure out. And also there could be security issues, like someone can jeopardize your site, and etc.
Another question there that came up, if please feel free to jump in, Mario or Michelle, if you have other thoughts too. I guess another question there was around the relative costs of these different platforms, and I think you've gone through that. I think Michelle did, and Richard did to a certain extent as well. Another person asked on related to funding, how you go about raising funds for that, and maybe that's a question for Richard and Christian too, about how to advocate internally within organizations, in addition to seeking funding outside of it, which is maybe a separate question. How do you make the case for going to these lengths with these places? I guess it feeds into another question that others had around the interplay between virtual visits and physical visits, and whether they actually kind of spawn, whether the virtual actually spawns physical visits. I'm wondering if you can comment on that whole idea of making the case financially for, you know, undertaking these initiatives.
I'll just add a little bit about the hosting costs, and then somebody else can jump into funding perhaps. The examples that I showed, Time Looper and Matterport, if you are using their apps and services, there is, it is, first off, it's hosted on their server, and then there's a monthly cost to that. So depending on the package or subscription you have with Matterport, for example, it could be $10 a month, or it could be $350 a month. The augmented reality app with Time Looper, I believe, is about $150 a month. And if you collaborate with them on some more immersive experiences, virtual reality experiences, they can go up to about $350 a month. So it really depends on the product that you have.
So I can speak to the case I did make. So there were a couple of aspects of this. First of all, at the time when we first did the tours, there was a grant that doesn't exist anymore. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it was basically a grant to get museums into technology. So it was a museums and technology grant. That's what it was specifically about. So we were able to that was a matching grant. We were able to access some of that money. But the key argument behind this was actually around accessibility. So we have museums that are, a number of them are National Historic Sites. A number of them are not accessible to everybody, in that there are stairs you have to go up. There's some of our museums, the house is literally built on a platform. And so if you can't go up the stairs, it's very difficult to access. And because it's a National Historic Site and we've got easements and various different things on the sites as well, it's very difficult to modify the sites to allow people access to them. So one of the purposes behind the virtual tours was basically to provide the same interpretation you would get another way. So a room that is accessible in the site, we could have a computer set up, people could take the tours, and they could experience the interpretation that way. The other argument, of course, is that expanding interpretation and allowing more people to interact with your stories and with your site is generally always a good thing. It's always something that the management want to be able to do. So the other argument I made basically was this will help for accessibility purposes, but it will also allow somebody who can't physically come to the site, or somebody who lives in, I don't know, Russia, if they want to take these tours and see the site. Or more, I suppose, a better argument is somebody wants to take these tours during the time when the site is closed. Well, they still can. They can still access the site, and maybe that will drive them to come when the site is open. Also, I did mention earlier school groups, and I've made that argument as well, is that this would allow educators and researchers to interact with our sites from wherever they happen to be to make the decision as to whether or not they wanted to come in. So, I mean, all of that added together to enough of a case to begin putting these sites together and to begin this work. So it was a number of separate arguments around it. The other question was around, do the tours drive visitation? That's a question I have less of a good answer to. What I can say is they don't harm it. But as I said earlier in my presentation, we've done a whole lot of things to drive visitation in addition to the tours. So I'm sure the tours are part of that. I'm sure some visitation has been driven from these tours, but I can't tell you to what extent that has occurred, because we've been a dynamic museum system and done a lot of other stuff that has also driven visitation.
One other question here, I guess, if others want to jump in too, go ahead, please. With the data question, a number of people were wondering, Richard, where you were getting a lot of that information. Was it coming from Google Analytics in terms of ages and these other things, and thus you were kind of surprised by that? Or were they from another source?
All of that data is straight out of Google Analytics. It was set up when the site first went live. And yeah, the reason we know the ages is because Google knows that about you. It's not data that we have gone out there and tracked down. It's data that Google already has. You can configure a little bit what you get out of the analytics, but all of the data is tracked by Google, not by us, yes.
Somebody asked a question about mobile. Richard, you mentioned that you had to do some changes to make it mobile friendly. Is that still true, or do the tools right now, they're automatically mobile friendly?
The biggest thing we had to do was when the tours first went live, because smartphones were in their infancy at the time, they were based on Flash, Adobe Flash. And that became a format that a lot of smartphones, most famously Apple, did not support. HTML5, which is a way of coding things for internet use, had not actually been settled on and finalized in 2011. So once that was settled and finalized, the tours were migrated to not operate on Flash, but to operate directly in HTML5. And that was, from a technical perspective, really what we had to do in order to make them mobile friendly. We also expanded the size of things like the maps and things, so they take up more of a mobile device's screen to make the navigation a little bit easier as well.
I'll just add in there that a lot of the virtual tours that are being created now are also compatible with cardboard viewers, like this one here. So that you can stick your phone right into the viewer. So I think most platforms right now are making sure that everything is mobile friendly.
Yeah, I think Michelle, the one that's on the slide that you have up on the screen there, that's probably like an Oculus, right? A more a $500 or $600 piece of equipment, but the cardboard version is gives you quite good results as well.
The virtual tours, most of the ones I've seen are compatible with the cardboard viewer. And then for a more immersive virtual reality experience, they're often developed to be compatible with the Oculus and other headsets.
Christian, there's a good question, interesting question here from Joe Callis about, is it possible, thinking about the reconstruction of the Lunenburg, the church in Lunenburg that burned a few years ago, is it possible to generate an acceptable VR result from a 3D model of a previously documented monument that is no longer possible to redocument using 360 cameras due to demolition? What about reusing older data to translate into a new form?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there's several examples that I've seen, like at conferences of cultural sites that have been lost, where there's been a call out to the public for them to submit their pictures. So it could have been, let's say if you have an old masonry bridge, and I think there's examples from war-torn areas where residents provided those photographs to the organization that made the call for them, and then they created the model from those photographs. So yes, there is some possibility to do that, and there's also examples of like as far as back as 10 years ago with, I think it was Microsoft, doing examples where you can actually search photographs. You can search a site on the internet, and then it'll assemble people's photographs of, let's say, the Eiffel Tower. I'm just using that as an example. And then it'll produce a model for you based on tourist photographs. So there are some possibilities out there. Of course, depends on how many photographs, the quality, etc., and how precise you want that model to be. All those things come into play.
Quick question around tricky places, and there was another one here which is quite interesting around glass and the photogrammetric capture of translucent or transparent surfaces. Not sure how you manage that. Also, there was one around how does the software that you use for something like the totem pole example manage light from sun or weather? I guess it's just like the lighting conditions and transparency, translucency, and those challenges.
Yeah, so for the example of the glass, that would not be an ideal situation. And if you really need to capture the metric surface of the glass, there are some methods to get around that, i.e. putting like a powder or something onto the surface to create that condition where you have texture. For stained glass windows, it tends to often work quite well, actually, because there is enough contrast or texture on the surface. For the lighting question, that's a good question. I mean, in that example, what you see is what you get. So the shadows, it was a sunny day. So if it would have been for a technical reason to produce orthographic elevations, etc., more of a scientific reason, an overcast day might have been more suitable. And that's when you look at your week's forecast and you plan your photo shoot, if you will, based on that, or go before the sunset or sunrise, but then you may not have enough lighting. In that case, I was using sunlight. So if the subject would be completely covered by shadow, or it's a cloudy day, it would have been, visually would have been different results. Metrically, like the geometry of the shape would be quite similar.
I think we've covered quite a few of the questions there. I don't know if any of the panelists had other comments that they wanted to make. I guess that whole kind of tension around, is it worth it to make the effort to spend the money and the human resource energy to do it? I think you've answered that very well. And I think Richard, in his in the longevity of the materials and the growing popularity of them there in Hamilton, have ably demonstrated that a relatively resource-intensive activity about 10 years ago has actually been added on to successfully and very as it's paid off over time in terms of the profile of those museums. Maybe I'll hand it back to you then, Michelle, and we can have final comments from Mario Santana.
We just wanted, I'll be really quick. So we just wanted to point out there's lots more information on regenerationworks.ca, lots of tip sheets about sponsorship and regeneration works, and other free webinars. So it's, you're actually now signed up for the newsletter and sign up for another one of these free webinars. And the next slide is about membership. And being part of this webinar, you can use the discount code NEWMEMBER to get a 30% discount on membership. And with membership, you get a magazine. We have 5 issues of it that go out, 4 digital and 1 print. You get discounts on the conference, and we also have 90 different historic places that form a network of places that you can visit for free with the membership in the National Trust for Canada. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anya. Sorry, I was just trying to unmute there. Okay, so I'm going to present Dr. Mario Santana for closing remarks. Dr. Santana is an associate, soon to be full professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Carleton University, teaching courses on architectural conservation and sustainability. He's currently an associate faculty member at Carleton Immersive Media Studio and the director of the NSERC Create Heritage Engineering Program. He has an architectural degree holding a master's in conservation of historic buildings and towns, and he obtained a PhD in engineering at the Lemaire International Center for Conservation at the University of Leuven. Along with his academic activities, Dr. Santana is currently Vice President of ICOMOS and member of ICOMOS Board of Canada. He's also the past president of the ICOMOS Scientific Committee on Heritage Documentation of SEPA.
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction, Michelle. And first of all, I would like to thank the National Trust for Canada. I think that these webinars are really excellent. And I want to thank you for giving the opportunity to have such an interesting content. I have been following the ones happening on the Tuesdays, and they have been very revealing and interesting to know the impact of the pandemic to the conservation of cultural heritage in Canada and beyond that. So, and in particular, I want to thank Sonia, Chris, and Michelle, and also to our distinguished panelists, Christian and Richard. Just a short introduction. The Heritage Engineering Program is funded by the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, CREATE program, and it has been around since 2015. And we have provided opportunities to Canadian and international graduate students and researchers to engage with the non-for-profit, for-profit, and government organizations across the country and beyond in developing cut-edge approaches for the conservation of built heritage. And the program will end in spring 2022. We are a group of scholars and professionals from 3 universities in Canada and organizations around the country and beyond. The program is currently hosted at the Carleton Immersive Media Studio at Carleton University. And basically, Michelle is part of the program, and she's doing an internship with the National Trust for Canada under this program. And we have other graduate students that are working across Canada for different heritage organizations in different parts, in the government, in the not-for-profit. And I think there was a question about training that I saw in the training, in the question and answers section. And there is no particular training for this. And I wouldn't say that you can follow this cooking, steps and you will be able to make a virtual tour of your site. I think that we have understood the complexity from both Richard, Christian, and Michelle about the different aspects. So Michelle went to all the digital assets, how you collect them, where can you put them, and then Richard talked about from the standpoint of an organization that wants to outreach outside their property boundaries using the web and using, kind of semi-immersive tools. And then Christian talked about photography, and anyone can take photos, and anyone can take 360 images with your phone and then put them online. But the key question is who and why. Who do you want to reach with this tool, and why are you doing it? And there were also questions about funding, how to support this. I would say that, implementing a digital strategy for outreach outside the boundaries of your site takes a conscious decision that you need to invest both funding to digitize your assets and then update them, as Richard was saying, collect that information correctly, like Christian was saying, and then where would you put them and how easy will be for people to interact. Now, I am actually writing an article for UNESCO about the technologies for COVID-19. And I was thinking in back of my head that, in the past we had conflicts in the Middle East, and there were documentation experts that went to the Middle East after conflict. There was crowdsourcing, collecting images to reconstruct arches that were destroyed by war. Then we had, the fires of Notre Dame, and then there were some people that did some laser scanning before Notre Dame, so some recording can be used for the reconstruction. So, but all of these involve moving or accessing the site or doing something. And now most of us are at home. And how can we contribute to all this? And I think that's a key question. How can we revolutionize from the sofa in our house? And I think that actually these webinars is a good way of doing it. So we are trying to provide outreach information, give you some feedback of how to do it. And then when we have a better situation, maybe we can plan, because as we have realized to this stage, this is not going to be the last pandemic we're going to have. And we have to plan, not only, we would have to balance, the digital content with the physical access to the site. After we resume and we go back and there's access to the sites, and I think that Parks Canada already mentioned that this is going to be happening gradually. So how would a person, first of all, we have proximity tourists that are going to come. We don't have massive tourism coming from different parts of Canada or different countries. And how can we attract those proximity tourists to come to our site? And how can we make their visit safe? And how can we gradually make this digital transition so we have some assets that are digital accessible? So on one hand, we have these tools to broadcast our knowledge and our site, and kind of, I think that I like, there is one of my colleagues at Carleton, Peter Kaufman, who is a photographer, and he says you can take a photo, but you have to control the message. And I think that this is the same with the digital assets that you want to do. You have to control the message of how you want people to perceive your site and what is it that you want to give access. Now, an static virtual environment or augmented reality provides a certain stage of interaction. Now, we have other ways of doing this. Maybe we can do guided tours. Now, if we can broadcast from our own site, we can make an Instagram live about something happening in our site. We can engage with Google Arts and Culture. Maybe they have some ideas. I have been talking to them, like for instance, getting an archaeologist from home and explaining one object at home. Like he will take his phone and he would say, how would you analyze this phone if it becomes heritage in the future? And these kind of ways engage people. Actually, one of my friends was saying, you might get tired of watching all the Netflix series. So what is next? How can you engage with people? So this is one way of looking at that and monitoring how your site impacts. Another aspects before I finish that I wanted to say that are also important is the monitoring of the site. So we don't have access to the site and we are confronted with secondary actions. Maybe not in Canada because we are a very conscious country, but in other parts we have looting, we have lack of maintenance of sites, we have the likelihood of a fire or a natural disaster that might happen, and how can we monitor that and how can we connect it to emergency services. So these are aspects that probably technology can also bring some ideas to the table and that we should be looking at as we resume back going to our sites. And I think that's all from me. I don't know if you have some follow-up questions. And thank you again, everyone.
Thanks, Mario. I'll just share this final screen here with our contact information for anybody who wants to get in contact with us.
I just wanted to say thank you to all the panelists. This was a great discussion today. You can see by the comments and everybody saying thank you that everybody was pretty engaged. It was really good. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody to come and listen to this discussion today. I think it's been really good. And just a reminder, we are going to email you both the slides and the recording for today so you can review it, share it, and keep in touch. Keep looking at what our next webinars are. It's a really great series. Thank you very much for everybody coming today.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye. All the
Bye,
best.
folks.
Bye.